I'd like to say, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, or wherever, whatever time it happens to be, wherever you are, and welcome to this InfUr webinar. My name is Kim Dovey, and I'm Director of InfUr, the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at the University of Melbourne. And while we are from many parts of this wonderful planet, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the particular place where this event is located, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This land was invaded in the early 19th century and has never been ceded. So this is the second in a series of webinars under the broad heading of the paradox of informal urbanism. We've framed this series to engage with or to move beyond the paradox that informal urbanism is deeply implicated globally in unequal practices and precarious livelihoods, yet at the same time represents a form of radical democracy that embodies the right to the city, that informal urbanism works both with and against the formal structures of the state. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Alfredo Brillembourg, who is an architect and an urbanist and founder of the firm Urban Think Tank. He's a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Bergen, and author or co-author of several books, including Informal City, the Caracas Case, and Torre David, Vertical Informal Settlements. We will have time for some discussion at the conclusion of the talk, and you can log a question by simply registering on the chat that you have a question. There's no need to write the question out. I'd rather you spoke the question to the seminar. And in the meantime, please keep your microphones muted at all times unless you are speaking. The talk today will be Reboot the Informal City from Alfredo Brillembourg. Alfredo, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. It's a real pleasure to be here amongst such distinguished colleagues. I will just now share screen, correct? Give me a sec. And then I believe we do this. Tell me, is everything good?
Everything is good.
Yeah. So let me start by saying this talk and collaborating with your institute is because I'm very interested in increasing our fellow professionals' knowledge and understanding of informal settlements. Its architecture's potential, culture, history, socioeconomic environments, and urban studies that we really have to focus on. We need to understand design not as a hermetic, self-referential pursuit, but as a powerful and creative tool. As you know, Urban Think Tank is a multidisciplinary design practice that was founded and led by me from its origins in the 1990s in Caracas under the government or during the government of Hugo Chavez Frias, who subsequently died. And now we have moved into a really chaotic government. And our practice has reached out to work globally since Venezuela's demise with projects all over Latin America, Africa, and in Europe. I guess we've become advocates for advancing the social engagement of architecture and undertaking site cultural specific works, which I will show today. So I couldn't be in a better group of people. I mean, Abdul Malik Simon actually came to our very first seminar ever in New York City, through Gwendolyn Wright, a professor of mine at Columbia University, who brought him along. And he actually was at the first meeting that launched the Urban Think Tank, which is interesting. And Fran, of course, I know from LSE, I've participated many times with Ricky Burdett. So, and Colin, I don't know, but I will get to know through your webinar. So I'm really happy. Now, I did title Rebooting the Informal, but I decided to kind of shift the title as I was working on it to Spaces of Coexistence. In the introduction, Kim talked about this dichotomy, formal, informal, and how we use sometimes informal tactics and against the formal or with the formal. And I think that coexistence is very interesting. Now, I wanted to reflect on the term informal urbanism as a kind of self-enclosed statement with no external reference point, from which the paradox itself emerges, right? And if it's true that we have no reference point for informal urbanism, it's because paradox is inconclusive themselves and afford no research for their resolution. So what is formal and what is informal is actually setting up the paradox. Today we can conclude is that any logical analysis of the urban context offers no way out to resolve paradoxes that we need, and we need an external vantage point, a means for assessing the cognitive viability of this incomprehensible thesis that we are involved in. So I'm going to try today to give you one vantage point. So the definition of informal urbanism. Informal is a slippery term. Aside from flexibility, it may suggest lack of order or intent. 2, informal hinges on the notion of flexibility and is moving collectively, whether consciously or unconsciously, towards a less formal, more flexible order. Could be a second definition. And informal as a condition of complex, nonlinear systems, which boundaries are flexible and patterns overlap and mutate in unexpected ways. Those patterns obviously are observed in informal settlements and termed as emergent patterns. You know, the idea of array of fields that biologists like to talk about for emergent evolutionary theories. Now, the word informal implies also a lack of clear authorship. Spontaneous creation, one that occurs as a result of factors that rather than the intent of a single creator, we've talked about it, kind of the single designer. And seen in this way, the informal sector, seen as a moment of a phase and a change in the cycle from agglomeration to specialization, right? Building agglomeration to something very specialized that only an architect can produce. Well, there's some place in between those things. I think Abdul likes to speak of this kind of practice of living, which is kind of the uninhabitable space, which is in between this specialization agglomeration. So given the large flux of immigrants, we've arrived at a moment where there's a kind of new emerging order, a new community being fully codified or formalized. Because as settlements grow, they become more visible, they become more formalized. Yet we're living also in a moment of flux where rules and categories have become become static in some places with rigid boundaries and more flexible in others. And I believe that in between that flexibility, which I think is also Abdul Malik, I heard a little bit of his talk, where he thinks that we can develop a practice of living in that moment, in that place of flux, of the urban flux. So in short, this is a poster, by the way, from 1998 that we put together a conference. Actually, the conference actually happened in 2002. But it's a photograph from 1998 where we were looking at Caracas, my hometown, 5 generations, where I was very frustrated with what I was seeing all around the cities. And we decided as a standpoint to change our practice from being a traditional architectural office to start to our interest for this informal urbanization. So why? We went from a kind of humanitarian standpoint. Informal demonstrates how spatial and physical factors create, reinforce, or contribute to the issues of displacement and migration. And I'll talk about that. From a theoretical standpoint, informal can serve as a critical lens for understanding the topic of cities. From a design point of view, which is actually, in the end, I'm a designer, informal is a condition of complexity in which patterns of habitation overlap, intersect, and mutate in unexpected ways. And that's the case study I'd like to bring today, one of my projects in Cape Town. And then the one thing that unites everything is flexibility. And that's something I've been characterized for. I like blurring boundaries. I like to cross over between, let's say, or break categories, if you want. So flexibility is the common ground among all these approaches of the informal, a model of a kind of an organic development that challenges the traditional Western planning assumptions. Now, I don't know if all of you know this image. Ai Weiwei, 1995. Remember, Urban Think Tank declared itself and made a change in course in 1998. So we love this image, where Ai Weiwei takes a Han Dynasty urn that's a historical artifact. He's from a aristocratic Chinese family, let's say, goes way back to the Cultural Revolution of Mao. And he grabs this artifact and he breaks it and into the ground. And it's what's referred to as the smash vase paradox. So why is it important here? The statement is there's no real harm in smashing something because it's still there, right? Is the vase still there? That's true or false. That's the paradox. That's the setup, right? The vase still exists because the mass of the pieces are still there on the floor. Not plausible, really. It does not exist. The vase does not exist. The vase can't be the same and put back together, right? Right, so that's a fact. The vase no longer exists, but with the broken pieces, you can create something new. That's an incontestable fact. And so we eliminate the first, that the vase still exists. No, it doesn't. And we can work with the second and the third. So if we transfer this idea to the informal city, we could say the city no longer exists as a planned city, as one conceived in the 20th century modernism. That's a fact. We discard it. So therefore, we can only work with 2 and 3 of the smash vase, and we can say, well, something new can emerge from it, which is the one that I like the best, right? The broken pieces. So the city still exists, right? But something new has come out of it, or will come out of it. So this is Caracas. This is an old lithograph that my father had on his wall. I grew up with we call it the Caracas of the red roofs. You see, colonial Caracas, settled by the Spanish in the 17th century, was a Caracas of red roofs. This is the idyllic picture of a colonial town. That's no longer what it is, right? And so therefore, that's the smash vase. A lot of my colleagues in Venezuela at that time were still thinking that the vase was intact. Even though they knew the city had changed, they still believed that the pieces made up that old romantic vision of the city. So when we brought the polemic of Torre David, maybe some of you know the squatted tower that won the Venice Biennale, I will show it. We brought it to say the pieces were broken. But something could emerge new. We were hoping to get the government to understand that, but they were still thinking in Stalinist ways. And so in a way, the Torre David for us in Ai Weiwei's parallel is our vase, right? We brought to the Venice Biennale a building that we considered was emerging architecture, if you want, or a representation of a new emerging architecture of my Venezuela, my Caracas city. So you may ask, is Torre David a slum? Because that's what people were calling it. Well, by definition of the United Nations, it's not a slum. A slum is on the periphery. It's a precarious construction. It has no infrastructure. In fact, people are living in with less than $1 a day. There's all kinds of definitions of what a slum is by the United Nations. And then the other question is it or is it not architecture? Well, that's up to you. I say it is. And I say it's not a slum because it's smack in the center of the city. It's a concrete structure. It's plugged into all water and electricity infrastructure. And it's just been finished as a tower by a collective group, community of people, 3,000 to be exact. And here you see it on the facades. And here you see the way the apartments were fitted out in the old office building over 17 years over time. People built their own spaces. And maybe that's what we conclude. We started to think more about a statement that actually Abdul Malik said, people are infrastructure. I think it's a really powerful statement. I thank him for that one. So we began to really think that maybe architecture is not about the form. It's not about structures. It's about people still. So we brought that discussion to Biennale, and you guys all know what happened between our films, our plans, our idea of how to help collectively the tower to shape itself and finish off its structures. And then the polemic around the newspapers were all printed on the walls. And then, of course, there's something of spectacular. Always an art exhibition has an element of exhibition, right? So we brought the neon signs from the local restaurant on the ground floor, and we recreated a kind of Venturi-esque simulation, but in order to create discussion about what is architecture. And we took that around different places in the world to try to understand what design methodology fundamentally could be in situ design methodologies, right? And so we've basically toured different cities to try to answer a few questions as a researcher, right? Where do we stand today? What is urbanization today, or the conception of urbanization? What are the forces vis-a-vis political beliefs, frameworks that inform contemporary roles? And how can one witness a growing frustration with architecture from younger generations who no longer willing to accept the truisms of conventional understanding of what an architect is and who's in charge of space? So, in a way, this is what I want to bring today. This is the book that came out. All of you can read. And here is one of the first images that I took when I had to get up in a helicopter in Caracas, where this dichotomy formal, informal was set up, which defined this kind of informal. You have on the left Petare and on the right La Urbina. Now, all of this with the highway in the middle was one farm. In that first image I showed you of Caracas, this was a farm owned by a Schlageter family. And then the era of oil, 1970s, began to build highways and divided the farm in half, building this highway that leads you out of the valley. But the highway took 30 years to build. So over the time, the workers and the shacks along the highway building the farm, they expropriated the area of the highway from the owners of the farm. And then over time, the builders brought their families, their workers. It was a long process, and they inhabited the hill of Petare. Petare was an old town. There's an old town up at the top of Petare, which makes it kind of a significant place in colonial history. But then the owners of the farm asked for new zoning rules. They gave up one side of the farm to the municipality, and the municipality just let it go. And they did nothing. And it grew into the biggest slum or barrio in the world. And this is Caracas, a new image of Caracas, not the one I showed you at the beginning. This is the reality with pockets of wealth and poverty spread out and highways. It's a classic vision of a Latin American metropolis, but I could say also Indonesian, Jakarta, I could say also Bangkok, I could say many places around the world. So this is what we call, and Kim I'm sure knows, is the Sur Global. And together over years, a bunch of friends of ours have put together this map, which shows, it's actually a graph. It shows the expansion of informality, basically. It's a graph because it's actual real data that shows you that most of the world's population will be born in the global south, and they'll be born in that proportion in Africa and Southeast Asia and South America. So, I mean, that's where the majority of the population of 2 billion people coming onto this earth in the next 30 years will be born. So we need to debunk those myths of marginality. So informal settlements are not the problem, but the solution. They're a housing solution. If the governments aren't building them, let people build them themselves. It's perfectly fine. So they can no longer be defined as illegality. They can no longer be defined as lack of urban services. They can no longer be defined according to precarious construction materials. We all know that, you know, the barrios of Caracas are here to stay. They're made out of concrete and block. They can't even be defined as free places to live as they were before, because people are charging rents now, you know? So then they finally cannot be defined as communities of misery and chronic poverty, of only misery and chronic poverty. No, they have actually become, have a huge economy of informal, as you know, from Dharavi in Mumbai, you know, producing $1 billion a year in revenues. So this is my first book. Maybe Kim, I don't know if the faculty has it. It's hard to get to. It's a relic. Informal City. It soon will be available online. You can download it from our website when we get that shop going. So by 2050, we're told that there's a population projected to increase from 7 to 9.6 billion. More than 90% of this growth will occur in the cities of the developing South, which I've mentioned again. I'm kind of hitting the points on the head, where the population will more than double in the South, right? By an additional 1.3 billion people. So mostly the cities where an estimated 60% of the population will reside, right? And the current 62% informal urban population is expected to rise. So slums, they'll rise in slums. An unprecedented urban challenge demanding the needs and forms of engagement. So your institute is right on. And if people don't want to see and educate the architect in schools and prepare them for this reality, then they're not educating the global architect. So the largest growth will be in this region, the map that I just showed again. Now, I didn't invent this. There's been incredible people who I'm just following in the footpaths of. John Turner, maybe some of you know this book, Housing by the People, The Freedom to Build. Incredibly important books that set me off on the right path. Now, I thought that architects could really separate themselves from the process of communities building themselves. And I had many, many arguments with Joel Bolnick about this, Slum Dwellers International, headquartered in South Africa. They've done a great studies and research and promotion on this topic. However, we came to the conclusion that, and so did John Turner, that architects are very important as mediators in a process. So it's not the architect as the principal designer, but he knows a lot. He can bring he can leapfrog technologies. The architect can be very useful in the moderation of a grassroots project and with the moderation with the government that has the infrastructure. Here you see images of Peru. I'm sure you guys have seen this book before, how whole settlements and cities were being formed and still are being formed. This is my recent trip to Peru. You will see that it's still being formed that way. Basically, they settled the lands. This is at Arequipe, which is very fertile for tin mining, etc., and also very fertile in vegetables. And certain valleys are incredibly green. And they first settled these desert-ridden valleys, and they put the community that settles it with the leadership, of course, they named themselves Asociación SA. So they give it a number and they begin to trace roads and then stake out with sticks and to create a kind of gridded structure. Slowly, improvised with precarious material, they begin to build little shacks. And here you see the overall neighborhood. Then the government steps in and says, oh my God, they're populating a neighborhood. I need to win some votes. Government steps in and does a highway. Or sometimes they plug themselves into a highway, right? So now there's a transport and a bus stop that can be devised, right? And then over time, they begin a production of mud bricks and it becomes formalized. So what was informal first, or you could debate whether it was formal or not, or had just another set of rules of habitation, becomes formalized, and over time, it grows into a normal city. Now, I only bring that example to show you the connection with what Team 10, maybe some of you know Alison and Peter Smithson. They went to the Siam in Ototemi in Finland, and they went to present in Siam number 9 their idea of the relationship between street, city, valley, city, urban neighborhood, right? And they made this grid, and they based it on the research they were doing in North Africa. And when they arrived at the Siam, Le Corbusier said, I don't understand this. Why are you looking at the beaten fields of North Africa? And but they had done such a great argument for the importance of looking at the informal that Le Corbusier, well, maybe I'm getting too old. And actually, Le Corbusier, that was the last Siam he attended, and he retired from the Siam. He said maybe a younger generation should take over. Of course, I'm just giving you guys a little bit of background. Then you've got John Habraken in 72, who talked about the open building. Maybe some of you know his ideas, where he says, why don't we just create a structure, like the outer infrastructure, which is the walls and the roof, and allow people to inhabit the inside of those structures as a more flexible organic system. So he wanted already to look at the outer shell and the inner occupation, to divide that, and that the cities and mayors should start to devise mechanisms where one is a public good, which is the outer shell, and the inner shell can be flexible and changeable to the individual's decision making. And then you have more recently of my good friend from Switzerland, Hans Widmer, who wrote Bolo Bolo, which is, he's trying to devise what the perfect community could be like. And he comes up with numbers, statistics of how to devise a Bolo Bolo, which is this neighborhood, what he calls, or community of 5,000 people, which is basically based on a Swiss village. So who are we? Kim, just interrupt me if I go over time. Who are we? Well, I'm going to take you through this adventure to understand me, because that's all I can do. I can tell you my story, right? So I left Caracas in 2007, trying to understand what had happened. The revolution got incredibly violent, and I've become now a kind of global migrant. So let's see where I'm speaking from. So this is my new magazine, which I hope all of you buy and maybe download, and it's in Hanja Khan's, but it's published with the University of Bergen. To say that the globe is becoming urbanized is a cliche, right? I've been telling you all about that, and directly unhelpful if we are to comprehend our ailing planet. The solution is simple. In order to avoid getting stuck in the truisms, we need hard-hitting and visual striking accounts about the spectacular dynamics and ever-changing inequalities, and not least myriad forms generating and creatively characterizing the world's astoundingly diverse cities. This is Bjorn Engelbertsen, who's part of my institute, The Grip. He leads it in Bergen. He's fantastic. You would be very interested to participate with him, and I think you should invite him one day. He's an urban sociologist. And together we've conceived this journal that will come out once a year. And we're working on the next one. This is this year's journal, and we'll work on 22 with all of you. So maybe some of you have read Benedict Anderson. I like it because I like this idea of imagined communities. So no longer was I part of Caracas. No longer was I part of this 5 generations in one city. That's traditionally the architect works in a city. I mean, it doesn't go too far from the city where he's established his company. But now we are now migrants also, and we have to imagine what the idea of a community and a neighborhood is. So we have the individual world, which is the one I'm telling you about, and you have the public world, and then you have the scientific world. These feedback loops is what Norbert Schultz wonderfully characterized in his book. And it's a diagram that I like because it's all about the shared communal knowledge. And I won't go into reading more about it, but you guys can read in his book, Existence in Space and Architecture, the phenomenological point of view. But let me tell you a story of this turning of the world's brim, about informal, formal systems from Caracas to Guangzhou to Lagos to Cape Town, which is my story. Today, many cities are unintentionally built without planning, and this is a positive if we understand the system. I was reminded of this rushing to the airport and cursing poor travel plans. This mix of formality and informality become my specialty, spreading a design discourse that encourages experimentation, social engagement, and global awareness. We're starting to do this 20 years ago. Imagine 20 years have gone by since we left our home city of Caracas. You know what Walter Benjamin observed. And in fact, either you find yourself between, let's say, Benjamin, because he's the first one who, when he did, maybe some of you read his Moscow diaries, where he went up to Moscow wanting to join the Communist Party after the revolution, and he got to cold, freezing Moscow, and he wrote these journals, which were about the observation of a city. So we have now learned that urban sociology, and we've learned a lot from it, this observational point of view. And he says, rather, people spend most of their time thinking about the recent past because it's what we sense has impacted us greatly. We are concerned with the historical injustices of 1 or 2 generations back, which war killed or which displaced our grandparents' parents. We focus way too much on the cultural norms of the last decade, or consuming, clothes, technology, in very immediately, and food based on trends that change seasonally. And we dwell much too much on the recent past of our social relations, evidenced by consumption of gossip in our intimate lives and mass media, instead of talking to your neighbors. You see, this is the interesting thing, is that we have to shift ourselves away to either looking backwards too much or to being engulfed in the present, and instead try to find out what's going on around you. So let me take you to the story about Guangzhou, which is part of the Pearl River Delta, the industrial corridor, which produces 2 billion of foreign investment. 2 billion foreign investment is flowing in on a monthly basis. All third of exports from China originate from Guangzhou, right? So I was there. After clearing the security area, I discovered that the flight was delayed, and this story I'm about to tell you is from there. I found a seat at a gate, and I had some tracing paper, and back in the airport, a man and woman were lying together, sitting across from me, and it looked like they were ready for a long delay. And there's this guy from Uzbekistan who has arrived in town called Sunat. Sunat is on a mission to create a mobile phone components for his country's branch of the Finnish company Nokia. This man called Sunat is wearing unkempt business attire, slouching to one side, and quickly clarified to me, "Are you comfortable with all this traveling?" The space between us was abnormally close. The furniture arrangement had brought us together for the first time and probably the last time. Our lives were intersecting in a singular moment of exchange, though unlike most of the intersections, ours were not monetary. It was rather a narrative in nature. Like today, it reflects my desire for a conversation. This is what he was coming to buy components for. But in Gwangju, he needed to find a factory owner with the right qualifications, in which in this case was having a 10-year-old daughter who can speak English and translate their business meetings in a vocabulary she learned while watching Disney movies. This is all told by him. Everything is the blood and guts of the global economy. These people are expert travelers. They know the world. They're informal, traversing the formal and the informal, on the ground politics, prejudice. They're bending formalities and rules and taking advantage of these obstacles because they have to negotiate on a daily basis. They know the reality of the informal system, and they know that they are within the formal system. There are different kind of globetrotters, of entrepreneurs that signify the idea that you travel up, but it's done in the most informal way. What I'm trying to say is, given the globalized capital markets, given our mobility and the demand for it, the rules of the games have changed to reward us into a necessity. Yesterday's payoff is today's nomadic informal survival. Back in Gwangju, it's not over. It's nearing Christmas. And so the parts of the sea start to smell more and more like burnt plastic, as they usually do, as the factories pump out bags of green tinsel for exporting to America for fake Christmas trees, right? So Lou, the factory owner, has accidentally produced too many pencils with dinosaur heads that, play this techno song. But he negotiated a deal with a German dude, Werner. And Werner's a buyer for the chain outlets in Germany of the €1 store, assuming that Werner's €1 store doesn't collapse before, he gets the merchandise there. And at the same time, you have these two Nigerian guys, Olu and Nelson, who smuggle lumps of hash into China. This is all the story, a true story, which often carries a death penalty. They were at the airport dressed like 50 cents because they were hoping that if they have a hip-hop look, they will look like Americans and therefore won't be checked at China's administration for American symbols. This incidentally exemplifies one of the tenets of America's power structure. It's easy to be an American outside of America as a minority American. So while the hoodie and the flat-brimmed baseball cap are symbols of membership in a culture of exclusion and poverty in spheres of U.S. society outside of America, they're cultural tropes of wealth and privilege. For Olu and Nelson, they're shields protecting, they're brims of their hats. They're turning the world around. Now, Olu Nelson, so after successfully getting into Gwangju, Olu Nelson head to the Arab trading areas where they meet Tariq, where they sell their small bags to the Saudi dealer. And in the Egyptian restaurant where all this is happening, they constantly replay 9/11 newscasts as the towers crumble, flickering on the screen, and the whole restaurant will stand up and clap. Meanwhile, Olu Nelson take a bit of their funds, their cash, and buy a batch of Obama t-shirts made from Vietnamese fabricated cotton at a local factory. To sell back home in Lagos, one of these shirts will eventually be photographed on a famous Nigerian actor who's rising to prominence in the country's Nollywood film industry. The film, along with the t-shirt, will be seen throughout all of sub-Saharan Africa and will inadvertently start a fashion trend in South Africa. These are the DVDs with that on it. So I found myself in South Africa meeting a young model named Nadine that wears the t-shirt at a party. And I'm interested in this mixing and hybridization of cultures, markets, and price. Borders function with a different mode of osmosis, and the movement of people and the goods define linear conceptions of mobility. Maps are unraveling the formal-informal connection. So Sunat played a pivotal role in a microeconomic system that created jobs, satisfies demands with the market, makes a profit, and goes into productive accumulation of capital. However, despite the enthusiasm for living he's making, he was starting to doubt whether his actions are doing good, and whether the big picture of the good, the transnational version of living the American dream, was slowly erasing, and his beliefs of destiny for spiritual and ethical fulfillment. For him, the most of the people around him, the places in the world, were all about short-term necessities, and it's about minimum existence. So as a difference to Sunat, he and I are essentially the same. We both move through the world, producing, moving, consuming, thinking. We think about things, we try to build, we try to change, we try to produce. Our way of life most of the time is paradoxical, albeit a globalized form of informal urbanism. So this we that is so talked about, we have invented as a community idea. I'm not from South Africa, but we created together with a community in South Africa, the Sikona, which is we are here. Basically, it means that where I arrive, I have to assert myself and integrate myself in some way, find a vehicle. So what do we think about? We think about the right to the city, the right to infrastructure, the right to housing, the right to safe cities, democracy, because I believe architecture and urbanization and planning can create democracy. This is Caracas. This is the protests on the streets of Caracas. So that is why I do believe that the architect plays a role in creating democratic cities. What do? Well, these constructed scarcities that I just narrated is an aspect of our lives. We're told there's a housing crisis. Everywhere we look, there are empty properties. Scarcities that constructed through machinations of tenureship and ownership. This is, if I hadn't flown over the city of Caracas to see what was happening in the informal city, I would have never ventured in there. It's impossible. You need to go in with specialists, with people who live there. So let's redefine our understanding of urbanization by making projects and then formulating new discourses. Of course, I've written a lot of articles, done a lot of books, and that's what I'm trying to do. I build in order to build case studies for them. But of course, this is as you know, I am an architect, I'm trained. This is the first autistic children's school built as a ramp in vertical in Caracas. I won't go into them. These are the vertical gymnasiums, community centers that change over time, 4,000 square meters of community space. The cable cars, which is mobility. So we work in health, sports, mobility, youth structures, and education. This is an education facility for music and dance in Sao Paulo. Now, and this is the latest project being built at the moment, which is on our arts and crafts school in Barranquilla, Colombia. So architecture materializes uneven development. And as architects, we have to be very conscious of this. So we have been complicit in the process. So that's why I have decided to work in public structures that really can have a kind of social entrepreneurial change. So in a way, like Sunat, I'm trying to make myself into kind of a social entrepreneur, or in a way. So this is the postcard from the project in South Africa. What you call a slum, I call my home. This is Pumezo and his family, who was my friend who enticed me to make this project in South Africa. So we've been dealing with question of slums and informality for over 7 decades. I would demonstrate that Empower Shack in situ upgrading is a unique and innovative project that produces new forms of knowledge. So in this area that you see outlined in white is Pumezo's community of 300 people. So there's a legal ambiguity. What are they? They're squatting municipal land. It's post-apartheid, right? You see the RDP red roof houses of what was the former township of Caliche. You have practical law on the ground. It's the law of the ground. But you have constitutional law that since Mandela, he said everyone has a right to a home. And then you have property law, the market. And the three don't speak to each other in the Freedom Charter, no less. So you have urban projects, right? And there's about 100 million slum dwellers in the world, right? Rural, urban, and other. And this is the UN Habitat Report. And we have to be conscious of how, as architects, we can intervene, right? State investment in housing is per government. Of course, you have Norway, Switzerland there, you see huge, right? And then you go back and you look at South Africa state investment. And this is all in constant GDP per capita. So these areas will never be upgraded sufficiently. So I found it a challenge. And this is the photograph I took where I saw this one building that went up 2 stories. I said, this is the eureka moment. I don't invent anything. I just observe what's on the ground. And I said, if we can teach people to go up vertically, like in Caracas, like in other parts of the world that they in Mumbai, etc. They construct vertically, but it's sand. Their shacks are on sand, so they don't know how to make the structures. So here you have rich Cape Town, right? And Kailicha is 30 kilometers outside of Cape Town. It's on the fringes, but it has a great a train station. So it has a market. And I won't go into the very details of how it was settled and how land was formed, but during the apartheid government, Cape Flats was made into a township. And today it holds about 700,000 people. And here you see in red, of course, all the marginalized population. And you have a bit of blue, which is the Black African, and you have the colored, and then you have white, of course, and Indian. And you see the segregation, and here you see the apartheid plan. Cape Town is all white. You see it all around the 30-kilometer radius, right? So this master plan of segregation, you know, is the white city, but camps were first formed, which later was the act, the Natives Act, which basically was a slum clearance and settled. And this is District 6 in Cape Town, evicted a whole population to move them into social housing. I won't go. Here you see the architects of the apartheid designing areas in the Areas Act. And this is basically the master plan. You give an infrastructure point, which is a train station, and then you segregate white, black, and colored with physical barriers. And you can see that the white is the CBD, of course, the center of it. And then you have the Africa homelands on the outskirts divided by real barriers. Here you see the gravitational over time of people moving to Kailicha and settling as it got bigger and bigger, and it keeps growing every day. You know, the idea that they had to have the passport, right, which was passing the law, you had to hold it, and the Group Areas Act, and all of this horrible reality. And here you see District 6, it's become a kind of burial ground. It's a cemetery where the eviction first took place, where the most violent act of removal in the CBD of Cape Town. I won't go through all of this.
It would be good to wrap if we could leave some time for questions.
Of course. Okay. So this is what you get. Democracy wins. And through that, Mandela declares he's going to do the RDP project, which is to give everyone one of these houses. But they couldn't build enough, although they built 2 million of those RDP over time till now. However, land got more expensive. They had to move into the outskirts of the city. It's become a mafia to get on the waiting list. And there's about 3 million people waiting to get on that list and to get a home. So what happens? As the influx from Zimbabwe and the breakdown of other nations surrounding South Africa, people have been coming, and you have a housing backlog. And you have people building shacks and still cooking fires and heating themselves with kerosene lamps that fall over and burn. So when we arrived in Kailicha, we observed these are our photos from the air, and we saw that there's 1 to 12 people in every shack. They take turns with the beds. And there's nothing in that is in the plans or the works of the Cape Town government or the city government to solve this housing crisis. So we came in, we zoom in again on the site, and we began a participation process, which is a research project. All of our projects are research projects with Pumezo as the leader. We grouped together, design research and brought together an expert team together. And we started to first investigate what was built. We put together our team of students and researchers to build a quick 3-day shack. How can we build for Pumezo a new shack that would be sustainable and lift him off the ground from flooding? He could change his environment in 3 days. It was an illegal act. We overstepped the bound. We didn't ask for permits, but of course, if they're building every day, why ask for a permit? And then from the next day, Pumezo had his shack. It was now a symbol of a new era for the Kailicha community, and at least 1,000 people came knocking at our door saying that they want to check. With that grouping of individuals, we were able to go to City Hall, put together this idea of creating a land release credit, which is basically mapping every home out, finding income and finding out the size of each home, number of people in the homes, and then making a master plan of the area, presenting it to the city, showing different prototypes that could be built, and working with the community on a basis of how to reorganize the neighborhood one house at a time. And each house was different. You can see how people wanted to live and group themselves together. And with that, we worked on prototypes. I will do it very quick. And you can see more of this in a book that we're about to release. So by going vertical, building two-story shacks, we liberated land, we could reorganize, we could build additional housing, we could have community space in the middle. The additional housing would finance the older housing. And together we could create this puzzle or this tic-tac-toe of moving people around. And tools, scenarios, we worked on digital systems of how we could move people around, we could enumerate, we came to agreements, we created a little iPad that would be able to enumerate each home, that became a document that we could sign with individuals as let's say an agreement, and then slowly we moved house by house by house by house, and we're now on the last phase of this project. And I will fast forward you with the computational models that we created with the Rhino plugins to devise the final scheme, which in the end looks rather formal because we went to block walls. The city obligated us. This is where we pulled the city in. We needed the infrastructure from the city. We needed to plug in to the sewage and drainage, but it was a twofold process. We worked on plugging in all these infrastructures, of course, the green, the blue, the water, the trees, the greening. We came up with resource ecologies of how to have integrate in the planning, the recuperation of rainwater, et cetera, and together a master plan was devised, or let's say a strategic plan devised, but still has a component of build it yourself. So I will just show you the original drawings and then finally the brick walls. So the architecture became the minimum existence, the design of how few bricks we could do, and then giving them a shell or a framework of this double-story shack that is tailored to each size of each individual who pays for 1/4 of his house himself over 10 years' time. The city pays for the other quarter, and then we got funding, NGO funding for the rest of the houses. And here you see the finished modules, which although it looks very formalized, each grouping, or let's say, or each block that you see holds 3 units. And the 3 units are very elaborately overlapping to form very unique configurations of these units, of these houses, each inside, and we leave them raw, and they're finished with little micro credits, a loaning vehicle that we've created for people to finish, plaster, and decorate their homes. And it's incredible the amount of capital that was invisible that has now appeared once people feel that they have their own homes. Here you see it plastered. Here you see communities starting restaurants, NGOs working to create schools in the ground floor, and people live on the second floor and create a business on the ground floor. Conclusions: it was a huge network that we put together that involves many practices, many elements together, raising awareness, research analysis tools, community participation, planning tools, and implementation to create a neighborhood. And this is the kind of toolbox: capturing research, diagnosing topography, thinking topological, going vertical, making networks, and distributing freely. And you will soon be able to purchase a book I think it's out in October, which will tell the full story. Sorry for this rush. Thank you, Kim.
Okay, many thanks, Alfredo, and virtual claps all round. We'll go straight into some questions. Before then, I'd just like to say that we're almost at the hour. So if people need to drift off to other things, we'll continue because I think this is some interesting discussion. But if you have to leave, then thank you very much for coming along. As I said before, if you have a question, just log your name onto the chat list and I'll take the questions in order. And the first one will be from Punita Thakur.
Hi. First, let me say it's a very interesting and an eye-opening presentation. And then I need your advice or comments on the issue, especially I come from a place called Chandigarh in India, Le Corbusier city, a modern city. In fact, I was born in the city and I call myself as the first generation of citizens. And what is happening in this city is, as you know, it's a planned city. The administration and the public architects are fully denying anything to do with any informality. They are the strict architectural bylaws, the street hawkers and any slums are denied of. The architects wanted to retain it as a heritage status. And in a city that was designed for 500,000, now it's touching around more than a million population, sorry. So what are your comments and advice to the architects in Chandigarh?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. Let me do a quick sketch, right? I'll do it very quickly because here you have, let's say, the National Parliament at the top. I'll just put it here, okay. But then Le Corbusier, okay, let me put it and then, so you know this image. So the Parliament's up at the top, right, which is incredible, crazy kind of modernist plateau, which is completely barren. It almost looks like an airport, let's say, or which with its open plazas, which was intended by Le Corbusier to be occupied with informal vending. So he thought these open areas were to be inhabited with new programming, so with different programming all the time. I did see a few vendors on the Parliament grounds once in a while, but not in a kind of a market square idea. Then Corbu, of course, he created the gridded city, the 9-square grid that you know from his drawings. But then he permeated that 9-square grid with green arms. You might know this, no? That run through the neighborhoods, that run through the housing. And I think his intention was that all of this housing, when it meets the green zones, it was to create very interesting pockets of appropriation as it approaches the green zones of public space and appropriation. So I think he had in mind that he would lay out this planned city. Let's call it the infrastructure. Right? He laid out the supra infrastructure for people then to inhabit it and to appropriate it in their own creative way. So I think your government needs to protect the supra infrastructure, the greenways, the spaces, let's say the roads that you know that are all numbered, right? The roads are all numbered in Chandigarh. No, but to allow the housing and the intersection between the smaller streets, which are the individual interior streets, to be pockets of experimentation. So I think a new zoning plan that could be clear of reinterpreting Le Corbusier's ideas could be devised. So that in that way, I can help you. We can do let's say a 2030 reinterpretation of the plan, of Corbu's plan.
Thanks, Alfredo. I need to go on to Amanda Rakhmati.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Alfredo, for Very fascinating talk. I have a question in regard to your comment earlier at the start when you mentioned that we need to prepare our students to become a global architect. So we need to kind of introduce this really complex urban conditions more and more in the education side of our design community. Look, in the case of our faculties, Kim and I, and also Redden, we've been running traveling studios, and they are some of the most challenging studio to teach, but as very rewarding at the same time. It's very challenging because it involves changing the way our students see, the built environments. And it's very intensive at that stage before they get to kind of thinking about responding to the context as a designer. I'm just wondering if you can share your experience. How do we change, the way we teach design, this studio curriculum, to situate the global South more at the center of architecture education?
I was very apprehensive on traveling studios for a long time. And that's why, remember, I resided myself into a locality which was Caracas, which I knew and I could really understand, and I could work with my own city very well in minute and very careful ways, right? And then because it's unbelievable that that we don't even know our own cities, right? The boundaries outside our own cities and the informality in our own cities. But then I realized that what's really interesting to me was to see if Caracas was everywhere. So, in other words, as a thinker, as an individual, I wanted to confront myself with the realities of the rest of the world. And it was in those confrontations of realities between South Africa, or let's say Cape Town, Caracas, Sao Paulo, Caracas, or even more specific, a neighborhood, Paraisópolis, Petare, right? Just two neighborhoods in which then I reduce it down to the neighborhood level, and I started to see very interesting points of intersection where I could bring some ideas I thought about from Petare, topography, this and that, or ideas of building vertical, to Cape Town, which they didn't build vertical. So there were very interesting intersections that I found were a huge effort. Of course, you're a parachuter in, right? You parachute in, and that's very badly seen by many who say, oh, you come in for 2 weeks or whatever. The important thing of those studios is to create a network. You see, if you don't just parachute in and out with your studio, but you create a network that goes on, that feeds itself over time. So you have to structure your curriculum to know what you're building. If it's just one professor just doing parachuting studios, and it doesn't work. That's why I've been saying we've got to change the whole conception and methodology of how we're teaching to be global. But if you're not teaching to be global, you're not teaching at all.
Thank you, Alfredo.
Thanks, Alfredo. I'm going to throw a question in here. The project that you've been doing in Cape Town and those buildings, which I've actually seen some of them when I've been there, and it's a very interesting project in a whole lot of ways. You talked a little bit about it being almost finished and in the last phase, but to what extent will that be finished, or to what extent will it be just a kind of pressing a reset button for another round of informality? Maybe 3 stories, maybe 4.
It's perfect. So sorry, I must rectify. You're very right. When I said or finishing, it's what I committed myself to doing. So as the moderator, there's a process where you step out. You do the best you can, you create the prototype, you work with the community, and you come to an agreement of your involvement. And so I'm in the last phase of that agreement, but you're absolutely right. The community is already building additions onto the houses as we speak today, and we're building a playground. There's going to be a community center that will come into play. There will be all kinds of additions, solar power coming in to play also. So it probably will never be finished. and it will be an ongoing process, organic process of adaptation to the modules that we've established. And I don't think it's going to be a perfect example of what we can do. It's just the example that surged at the moment that we did it, and under the conditions we did it. But just in the way John Turner's work wasn't perfect, in the way that Previ's work hasn't been perfect, in the way Habraken's 2 or 3 projects he was able to do of this infrastructure and then software and hardware kind of architecture was not perfect. I believe that we need to still leave examples. We need to build on each other's examples and to leave a generation, future generation, continuing the process of experimentation. Because the finish, as we talked about in the beginning, the city is never finished. And it's rather in these intersections of formal, informal, or in this formalization of Caliche, of this neighborhood of BT South in Caliche, that will be formalized and then informalized, formalized again and informalized. Yes, so it's a constant.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think these conversations are also never going to be finished. So, but I need to call this one too.
The conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, Kim. So that's why I debated whether to take out the global traveler story. I debated in this lecture today because I thought, oh, it's taking us all for ramification. The important thing is I'm very curious about the world. And that's why by speaking to people, by engaging, I was able to come up with a lot of things that I've done in my life, randomly, informally, intersecting strange things together. And I believe that hybridization, which is where I'm from, this is South America. South America is probably the only continent that is, or the American continent is the only place where the mixing pot, the true cosmic society, what Octavio Paz wrote, not me. Octavio Paz called, we are truly the mix of races, Indian, African, Asian, and European. So I like this mixing together. And I believe that that's hybridity is the secret of design for the future. And flexibility.
Okay, I want to thank you very much for your contributions here today, and a very interesting range of ideas. I'd like to remind everybody that this is the second in a series of 4, that the next will be Colin McFarlane in about a month, and then followed by Fran Tonkus about a month later. And I hope that you can join us for that. We've got a very, very broad range of people tuning in, which is great to see from many parts of the world. I'd also like to remind you that the recording, a link to the recording will be put up on our website within a day or two. And if there are people you know who you think might be interested, or people who are in different time zones and haven't been able to tune in, maybe you can send them the link. So again, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Alfredo, for such a wonderful talk.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much. Thank you all. I wish you all the best.